Some people just fight for the sake of fighting. You know, when Rashi does not address an issue that seems to be a glaring question in the Torah, we have to wonder why. In this particular case, it's to teach us exactly that message. We've already explained multiple times that Rashi in his commentary will address any question that may arise as you're studying the simple understanding of the pasuk. And if Rashi is unable to find a suitable explanation that fits with the pshat, with regards to a particular question, whether it's about a particular pasuk or a particular word, then he says, I don't know a reason why this is. From which we can derive that if there is a pasuk that seems to have a particular difficulty, that Rashi does not address, that itself must prove that it's obviously not a question at the pshat level of understanding, the simplest level of understanding the pasuk. Or Rashi has already addressed this issue in an earlier commentary, and therefore there should be no question at this particular point in time, which is why we're going to have a very big question with regards to something in our parasha. What needs to be explained in our parasha is as follows. And the pasuk that describes two people who have a conflict and one of them has to be subjected to lashes, the pasuk says, Ki yeriv bein anoshim. If there is a fight between two people, they approach the judiciary who then judge them, and they exonerate the person who is the tzaddik, the righteous, and they illustrate the wickedness of the person who is the wicked. Then there's a procedure with which you apply lashes to the person who is seen as guilty. Now, that they exonerate or that they justify the person who is correct, and they blame or prejudice the person who is the rasha, surely that wording is superfluous. Because Shiri goes without saying, that that's what the courts will do. Obviously, they'll decide who's the guilty and who's the innocent party. All the pasuk had to say was, if there's a fight between people, they'll be judged. And this is how you punish the person who is guilty. Why does Rashi not address the fact that the pasuk seems to use language which is unnecessary? Okay, so we'll try and answer firstly from the person who's proven guilty. When the Torah tells us that they will solidify or consolidate the guilt of the person who's guilty. Maybe you could explain that it's a little bit of a stretch, but perhaps in these words, because the Torah is about to tell us that there's a punishment, so it introduces that by saying there's a guilty party. In other words, Zed Varakosov, this is what the pasuk is telling us. There's a fight between two people. And they find that somebody is guilty. If he is guilty of something for which the punishment is lashes, if he has to then be beaten, this is how you do it. Okay, first of all, that explanation in its own right is really a stretch, because safe, whichever way you cut it, those words to find the guilty party guilty is extra language. Because the moment you tell us that you're going to punish the person who's guilty, we realize there's obviously a guilty party. Why do you have to spell it out? But to the contrary, actually hearing those words that they will find the guilty party guilty could be misleading. As Rashi in fact points out, because it might lead us to believe that anybody who is ever found guilty in a court always gets lashes. Therefore, the pasuk has to clarify that there's certain circumstances where he gets lashes. So the words are not really helping us. But even if that were a good explanation, it still hasn't explained why we find the innocent party innocent. Why, in the simple understanding of the pasuk, do we need those words? And you cannot try and say that the simple explanation is to tell us that the Torah over here is yet again reiterating that the responsibility of the courts is to have a just system where the good people are actually proven innocent. Like you see, for example, in the case of not skewing justice, there the Torah repeats the same thing within a few psukim of each other in various ways to reiterate that you shouldn't corrupt the justice system. That cannot work here because the fact that it's telling us this is a scenario with two people who are fighting and then come to the courts implies that this is now new information, not just the repeat or reiteration of something we already know. So the question is, why does the Torah use extra language, and why does Rashi feel there's no need to have to explain it? So, Sifri, let's look at the Sifri, which will hopefully give us another perspective. There's an opinion there who says, the fact that the Torah says that you will find the innocent party innocent, from that we can learn that it means that you should find him innocent so he should not be beaten. Which means not only that you should find a reason for the innocent person to be innocent, but even when you know that the one person is guilty, try find a way to exonerate him from punishment. The first thing that you should do is try find some merit that you could apply to the guilty party, so that although he's guilty, he shouldn't have to be punished in this severe way of getting lashes. And only after you've exhausted all possibilities of exonerating him, then you could look for his guilt. And that, says the Sifri, would be very much like how we judge a capital case, where the halacha is clear that you first try and find mitigating circumstances, and only after that do you go with the full force of the law. So the Sifri gives a beautiful explanation, how to look at a Rasha. It's a beautiful explanation, but it's not what Rashi is saying, because you cannot tell me that this is what Rashi intends. Because if that is what Rashi intended, he would have said so. Because you cannot expect that a 5-year-old learning Chumash for the first time, who is Rashi's audience, would work this out on his own accord without being told. Especially if you consider the Sifri had to explain it to us, implying that it's not self-evident. If it's not self-evident, Rashi should have said it. Besides the fact that explanation, beautiful as it is, doesn't really work with the words. Because the two concepts shared in this pasuk, on the one hand, that you find the innocence of the innocent, and on the other hand, you found the guilt of the guilty. From the context of the pasuk, sounds like we're talking about the two different characters, the two litigants. The two people are fighting. One of whom is the innocent party, and the other is the antagonist. Whereas the Sifri's perspective is, the whole pasuk is dealing with one person. First, you look to find something to defend him, which is the words of v'hitzdiku, to justify his position. And then, when you cannot find any mitigating circumstances, then you declare him as a guilty party. That's not what the pasuk is saying. It's not the pshat. Rashi didn't even allude to it. Cannot be Rashi's explanation or his reason for not explaining. And we definitely cannot suggest that Rashi, in his approach to understanding the pshat, is relying on something the Gemara tells us. That this is not a straightforward case. This is a case of two people having a fight with witnesses, and then witnesses who contradict those witnesses. Where the Gemara explains what happens. You have people coming along testifying against the innocent party that he is guilty. Then other witnesses come along, and they set the record straight that he is in fact the innocent party, which in turn, of course, discredits and in fact creates for these Eidim what's called Eidim Zomimim. They are now the guilty parties. And then the Gemara says, who's the wicked one who has to get Malchus? Those witnesses. That cannot be what Rashi expects us to know. It'd be ridiculous to suggest that for Rashi that is such an obvious scenario that we're talking about Edim Zimmerman who are not even mentioned in the pasuk, and therefore he doesn't have to explain the extra language. So we're back to square one. Why does Rashi not address the fact that it says which appears to be extra language in the pasuk? Here's another suggestion why it is that Rashi does not feel the need to address this question, why the Torah used what seemed to be superfluous language, create the innocence of the innocent, and expose the guilt of the guilty. Well, why doesn't Rashi have to explain it? Because Rashi has already contextualized the entire story earlier on when he explained those words, when there will be a fight. What does Rashi say about that? They're going to have a fight, and therefore, inevitably, they'll land up in front of the courts. Says Rashi something fascinating. A moment out from here, we learn, the result of conflict will never be peace. What caused Lot to separate himself from the righteous Avram Avinu? It was conflict. Okay, so what's Rashi telling us? So there's a question over here, which, like the Gur Aryeh and others ask about Rashi. What's the bad thing about landing up in the courts? Isn't that what you're supposed to do when you have a conflict? You go to a beis din to settle it. Because they approach the courts, surely Yavi B'neihem Shalom, that is going to create peace, because there's an objective voice that can tell us you're the good guy or you're right and you're wrong. Now you can settle your issues. Like it says that when Yisrael originally tells Moshe Rabbeinu to set judges and a cascading system of the judiciary, it says you'll judge the people, that will bring people to peace because they can resolve their issues. Isn't that the whole point? So why is Rashi suggesting that because you're going to come to the courts, there's going to be no peace? And what makes the question greater is this part that Rashi quotes about the fact that they'll go to the courts and then that's going to end up in conflict is actually from the Sifri. But the Sifri says it in a completely different way. Because the Sifri says the same as Rashi, conflict never leads to peace. Fine. Then he says, what caused one of the litigants to land up having to be given lashes? It's because there was a fight. In other words, the Sifri's version is that because there was conflict, therefore somebody is getting beaten. Rashi says something completely different. Instead of saying that the problem with going to the courts when you're having a fight is that somebody will get lashes, but he says the problem is you go to the courts. What's wrong with going to the courts? Now we can get to the core of understanding why Rashi doesn't have to explain these words, because he's already dealt with the concept of riv. It's a unique concept. Rashi, when Rashi comments on those words, ki yeh riv, Rashi is homing in on that word riv, a fight. There are many times in the Torah that we speak about people who have a difference of views and they come in front of the courts. Often those are called a thing, a matter that you bring before the courts. For example, it says, Moshe Rabbeinu says, when they will have an issue, they'll come to me, and I will judge between the two litigants. Or as the pasuk says, Mi bal devorim yigash eleim. When Moshe Rabbeinu is going up into Har Sinai, it says, if anybody has an issue while I'm not here, to you, that's where they'll take their matters. It doesn't say riv. We even use this in English. We have a matter. We're taking before the courts. But when you use the word riv, that typically means klapi ma'avak. That's a real conflict. The kind of conflict that people don't take to the courts. Kamoi, for example, the fight between the shepherds of Lot and the shepherds of Avraham Avinu. Nobody's going to the courts, they're fighting between themselves. Or like we have with Yitzchak, where the shepherds of Gror fought over the wells. As the Torah tells us the scenario of two people having a fight and they're beating each other up because they're not in front of the courts. So this is what catches Rashi's eyes in those words, ki riv. If you're talking about a legal disagreement, which should go before the courts, riv is not the correct word to use. In fact, he has further evidence that it shouldn't be called Riv, because when Unclus translates it into Aramaic, he does not translate it as Metzusa, which is conflict, which is normally how he would translate the word Riv. Eladin, rather he translates it as a judgment. So therefore, Rashi's asking, why does it say ki riv, that there'll be a fight, instead of saying there'll be a legal matter? Rashi is telling us, therefore you have to understand there's a unique psychology at play over here. Ki yeriv means, so from the Yisnigoshim el Mishpat, they're going to go to the courts, but the result is not going to be peace. Why is that? Because they're not just having a debate about who is correct legally, they're having an emotionally invested fight. And the psychology of people who are fighting with each other is it will never lead to peace, but even if they go to the courts. In other words, there are two kinds of conflict that go to a court. They have two people who have an issue and they all have their view of it, but they respect the courts because they want to resolve this and they want to have peace. And on the other hand, you have people who are fighting and they don't really care what the courts have to say. They're just being litigious, but they don't actually want to resolve the issue. Bichlal. Typically, if two people are having a disagreement that is not a fight, they'll sort it out, they'll settle their differences, they'll eventually come to a point of peace. Either because they'll learn how to compromise of their own accord, or they'll go to the Beis Din who will guide them to be able to mediate the case. And even if the courts decide there is no compromise over here, so-and-so is absolutely correct and the other person is absolutely out of line, because it's not a personal, emotive fight, and these are two people pursuing truth, so they'll get a ruling from the courts, and then that's it. We can get on with our lives. We can get along with each other because the objective courts, according to legal precedent, have decided how this should be dealt with. But when there is a fight at the core of the disagreement, which means we're no longer talking about a disagreement. This has become personal. It's not possible that that's going to produce a peaceful outcome. Yes, they'll stand in front of the judge. And the basin is going to give them a very clear judgment who's right and who's wrong. And even after they walk out with the court document saying Ploni ben Ploni is correct and Ploni ben Ploni is wrong and he has to pay back the money or whatever it is, they're going to walk out and they're still fighting. To that point, Rashi gives the example of Lot. What caused Lot to separate himself from Avraham Avinu? That there was a fight. Because if you think about it, why is Rashi saying it's a fight between Lot and Avram? It wasn't. It was a fight between Lot's shepherds, and Avram Avinu's shepherds. Avram Avinu, as the Torah tells us, Avram Avinu he testifies to the fact that Lot and he were like brothers. And despite their closeness, because a fight, an emotionally invested, subjective fight broke out between their camps, they could no longer live in one place in peace. And Lot had to go somewhere else, because that's the nature of a riv. It drives people apart. With that information, that will naturally and easily explain why why the Torah had to use what we originally thought was superfluous language to say you're going to justify the good guy and prejudice the bad guy. Because now that Rashi's explained that this is a riv, it's exactly what the pasuk is telling us. Because there's a fight between two people, it cannot result in peace. There's not going to be a resulting peace, but even via the courts. Because the courts are only going to determine who's innocent, who's guilty, who's right, who's wrong. But the problem is the litigants are not people who are looking for truth. And so they are not naturally looking for the kind of judgment that will help them settle their differences so they can live in peace. The reality of this is one person is a decent human and the other one is not. In those circumstances, all the based in has to determine is who's right and who's wrong. To clarify who is the decent party over here and who's the not decent party over here. But sort these people out, bring them together, the court's not going to do it, it's not going to work. Therefore, the Torah tells us, what is the nature of this judgment? Not to create shalom, as in other places, but clinically to tell us who's right and who's wrong. In fact, you could say that the Torah here is adding another point. We could have concluded that because this is a fight, but these are people who have this division between them. You'd say, oh, well, they're fighting, so they're both bad people, because they're both engaged in a conflict. Why take them to the courts? Why take people who don't know how to behave to court? You'd think, let's first punish them for the fact that they are in a fight. And then we could talk about who's right and who's wrong. Because the truth of the matter is, if we could break the fight, maybe they'd sort out their differences without us. So the Torah says, even when they're in a state of fighting where it's acrimonious, you still have to judge them. Regardless of the fact that there's this terrible discord, the courts still require or have the responsibility to judge them as they would anybody else. To get into all the details of the conflict, to explore and investigate properly what all the details are of this particular conflict, and based on that to come to a decision and a ruling. And even after you've done that, okay, so you've done the judicial part of this. Now you could say, but because these people are in this horrific, acrimonious fight, it's impossible that one person is actually right. Because if they are fighting with each other, surely they're going to exaggerate the position, say things about how innocent they are that are unfounded. And therefore you could come to the conclusion that if the judge is going to rule in favor of one of them, which is what the simple meaning of the pasuk is, this person is 100% in the right. You might think, well, maybe you're making a mistake. Maybe because these people are so emotionally invested in this particular conflict, they're going to overblow their innocence. And maybe you're judging this case wrong. Therefore, the pasuk continues, you have to justify the innocence of the innocent and expose the guilty of the guilty. Maybe at the fact that they're fighting with each other is an area in which they are equally guilty, because obviously you can't fight without an opponent. You have to have the impartiality as a judge to be able to say, but this is a court case which we have to look at clinically without being swayed by their behavior. We have to be able to clarify this person is legally 100% in the right and that person not. And we can also say, if you're looking through the lens of how Gemara learns, that actually the Torah is telling us something even deeper over here. The job of the Beis Din is to expose the person who is, from the start, the innocent party. In other words, when you have a true Beis Din who follows protocol as they should, and they arrive at the conclusion that an individual is the tzaddik, he is the correct party, you'll actually determine, you know what, he's not the person who stimulated or started this whole terrible fight. Part of the job of the Beis Din is also to identify who's the bad guy in the story, in other words, who's the initiator of the fight, who really carries the responsibility for the fact that this became so ugly. Whereas the other person is a tzaddik who got dragged into a fight that is not of his nature, not of his doing. And therefore we should be able to expose the person who is fundamentally the tzaddik, not only right in the area of this court case, but even to expose that this is the person who is right in the fact that he didn't want to get into an ugly fight, which I guess against his will he was dragged into. Fascinating layers of perspective why the Torah had to add these words. So the Beis Din will know its responsibility, and so we'd be able to distinguish between who is the rabble-rouser and who is the person who's just been so worked up that they are now in a fight, but it's not actually who they are.